Funding for this program is provided by Annenberg CPB to advance excellent teaching.
They were self-governing colonies ignored by the mother country year after year until new laws were passed to bring them under control. Now they were breaking the law and meant to keep on breaking it. The American Revolution, this time on the Western tradition.
And now UCLA professor Eugen Weber's continuing journey through the history of Western civilization.
In 1492, Columbus found a new land across the Atlantic, or at least a land new for Europeans. And the world of Western man was increased by 2 continents. Then in 1507, a German map maker published a map of the world incorporating the new discoveries, and he called the new lands America after Amerigo Vespucci, a Florentine navigator in the service of Spain. He could have called them Columbia after Columbus, but America, the new lands, remained, and the American dream was born to fire the imagination of those who didn't like the reality they saw around them in Europe, the violence and the corruption of the old world. In America, naked savages shared what they possessed. They had simple needs. They led harmonious lives. They were naturally good. America was a world that had escaped the fall. It had never known original sin. It was a golden world, truly golden, because it was full of treasure. Gold, silver, land for the taking, not to mention tobacco. The happy noble savage never existed, of course, and those inhabitants who did exist were soon wiped out by war, disease, and exploitation. But noble American savages peopled European utopias from the 16th century to the 20th. American utopia became a part of European consciousness. In the great open plains, American life was seen as closer to God and nature, simpler, more human. You could enjoy the purity of pioneer life, grappling with nature, coming to terms with it. You could find not just treasure, but freedom, liberty, true democracy. These concepts have haunted the European imagination since the first discoveries, and they've become part of the political rhetoric of America itself. Freedom and democracy were going to take a little time, however, because the first dream of America was really about riches. It was the hope of riches that drove hard, cruel, persistent men to conquer and settle new lands across the Atlantic, to fight over them, to kill, loot, exploit, enslave, finally to organize new societies on the ruins of what they found and took. The new societies came first in South America and the Caribbean, where Spain founded an extraordinary empire. The empire was bureaucratic, prosperous, stable, sophisticated, no more oppressive than Spain, less heavily taxed than Spain, more advanced than Spain, and certainly more advanced than the less attractive lands to the north. Where the north was muddy villages, the South was an urban culture. This, for instance, is Mexico City. The North was logs, the South was stone. Fine cities, great churches, universities, and libraries. There was also a social life to match Milan or Madrid, a merchant class to match Lisbon or Seville, and public money for urban improvement, for paving, lighting, water supply, for planting trees along broad avenues. Some of the Baroque masterpieces of the 1700s are still standing in Mexico City. But by the 1700s, the Spanish Empire was declining, and the South declined with it. A new world was rising in the North. It had taken the North a long time to catch up. By the 1530s, when the French first sailed up the St. Lawrence River, the Spaniards were already well ensconced in Mexico, Peru, and Cuba. By the 1580s, when the English settled Newfoundland and tried to settle Virginia, which they named after Queen Elizabeth, the Virgin Queen, Spanish universities in Lima and Mexico were already turning out more officials than Padua or Paris. There was no treasure in the North to attract colonists. There were furs, but you don't need a lot of people to trap animals and skin them. And the native Indians in the North were more warlike than those in the South. So really, the settlement of the North American continent didn't come until the 17th century. That's when the French founded Quebec and Montreal, and the English refounded Virginia. That's when the Pilgrims took 3 months and 5 days to sail from Plymouth in England to New Plymouth in what eventually became Massachusetts. The 17th century is when the Dutch founded New Amsterdam in what is now New York, when the Swedes founded New Sweden in what is now Delaware, and when John Locke wrote a constitution for the new state of Carolina, which was named, of course, after King Charles I. Tom Paine was going to call America the colony of all of Europe. Indeed, by the 18th century, America was attracting Welsh and Scots, Spaniards and Germans and Austrians to go along with the French and English and Dutch. And America was also a European colony in the sense that its new culture was European. Before the Pilgrims landed at Plymouth, for example, they had signed a covenant, which was a true social contract. They constituted themselves a civil body politic, they said, and they promised obedience to the just and equal laws that shall be thought meet and convenient for the general good of the colony. And so America was the colony of the European tradition of humanism and creativity born in the Renaissance, and culminating in the 18th century Enlightenment spirit. A spirit that the American myth and American possibilities fit very, very well. You can get an idea of this spirit when you go to Virginia and look at the extraordinary wilderness home that a young Virginia lawyer built himself in the 1760s. The lawyer's name was Thomas Jefferson, and he called his house Monticello, the Little Mountain. Jefferson made the plans for Monticello with the aid of a book of designs by the great Renaissance architect Palladio, whose 16th century creations you can still admire in northeast Italy. Palladio was coming back in vogue in the 18th century because his lines are the epitome of reason and harmony, symmetrical, proportional, never cold or dull or grandly stodgy. Some of the great buildings of 18th century England are Palladian or Neo-Palladian, but you wouldn't expect a Palladian mansion on the edge of Indian territory. Yet, that is what you get at Monticello, designed and built by a man who was as much a universal man as Alberti was in the Renaissance. Linguist, scientist, farmer, educator, town planner, and architect, horseman and musician, and since he was American, Jefferson was typically fond of technological improvements and gadgets. At Monticello, doors open when you approach them, a clock tells the days of the week, and the master's bed is placed so he can get out of it in either of two rooms. The American landscape may still have been wild in the 18th century, but a society that could produce a Jefferson was highly sophisticated, which also meant that it wasn't exactly poor any longer. Both the British and French colonies and their trade were now worth fighting for. They may not have been as important as the West Indies, which produced sugar and coffee and tobacco, and which both the British and the French thought worth far more than Canada, Canada which Voltaire described as a few acres of snow, and far more than the wilderness around the Ohio River, but they were still worth fighting for. In fact, the great 18th century wars between France and England were really about who was going to rule the seas and therefore command the colonies, because by then the crux of trade and wealth and power was seen as being overseas. So the British fought the French for world power, and in that fight, the British colonials in America helped their fellow British against the French and against the Indians who fought on the side of the French. It was in these French and Indian wars that men like George Washington got their military experience. By this time, the colonials had started to call themselves Americans, and they were glad when the Treaty of Paris in 1763 forced the French out of Canada, because that meant the French would no longer hamper their own movement westward. Nor would the French be there to arm and support the Indians to withstand the colonial advance into Indian territories. But when the French had been pushed out, the British, who had been seen as protectors, now began to appear as oppressors, or at least as a nuisance. Because the British didn't want trouble from their disobedient American children, they didn't want the Americans pushing into Indian lands and starting conflicts that would cost money. And even worse, the British, depicted here haughtily regarding a map of North America, the British wanted to tax Americans for services they, the British, provided, services which Americans now felt they could provide by themselves. The British wanted to harness the colonial economy to the interests of the home country. They wanted to control trade in the old mercantilistic way when the Americans were free traders. So almost as soon as the Treaty of Paris had been signed, British and Americans started to squabble, and within 12 years, they started to fight. That was the American Revolution. The American Revolution has sometimes been called 10 years of wrangling and 8 years of war. But actually the roots of the revolution were planted with the first English settlements in America. There are books which emphasize the fact that nearly half the history of this country concerns a period of dependence on Great Britain. This is true, of course, but it also gives a false impression. Because on the one hand, American cultural dependence on Europe in general and on England in particular was not restricted to the colonial period, but went on much longer than that. And on the other hand, it would be quite possible to argue that the American colonies were pretty much politically independent from the very beginning. For the most part, the colonial period is the story of self-governing colonies which were ignored by the mother country for decade after decade. Then, rather late in the day, and as it seemed to the colonists rather suddenly, an attempt was made to tighten things up, to get some effective control over colonial affairs through administration and taxation. The attempt failed, very much as a parent would fail if he or she tried to control a grown child that had never known any discipline. Furthermore, 17th and 18th century England was politically divided. It was torn by civil wars in the 1600s, it was torn by rebellions in the early 1700s. The English never were terribly interested in administering and controlling their colonies, and when they did try to control them, that aroused resentment. So the English drew back. By necessity or policy, colonial relations were oiled by salutary neglect, by letting sleeping dogs lie. And this left its mark on the colonists. It made it hard to order them around. You can drift into a policy, but habit becomes custom and establishes a sort of prescriptive right. There is a story that illustrates this point. 60 years after the Revolution, a man by the name of Levi Preston, who had been a Minuteman in Massachusetts and who was by now a kind of historical curiosity. Preston was asked about the English oppression, so-called, which had started, presumably, all the trouble. Oppressions, he said, what were they? I didn't feel any. Well, there was the Stamp Act. Stamp Act? I never saw any stamps. How about the tea tax? Well, I never drank a cup of the stuff. The boys threw it all overboard. Well, then, there were Sidney and Locke on the eternal principles of liberty. Never heard of them. We read only the Bible, the Catechism, Watt's hymns, and the Almanac. Well, then, says the interviewer, what the dickens did you go into this fight for? Young men, says Preston, what we meant was this. We always had governed ourselves. We always meant to govern ourselves. They didn't mean we should. Now, this conversation, I think, gives us a clear idea of one rather unexpected aspect of the American Revolution, that revolutions don't have to be caused by revolutionary ideas. The American Revolution was a conservative affair. It was fought by some people to resist further change. You might say to resist change and progress in the shape of the growing efficiency and the growing power of the British state. The beginning of the argument between the colonists and the London government was legalistic. The British imposed a tax, and the colonists said, you can't impose this sort of tax, it's unconstitutional. And so the British would withdraw the first tax and impose another sort of tax that was just as odious as the first. And when the tax agent kept coming, Bostonians poured tea down his throat after tarring and feathering him. The point, of course, was that the colonists did not choose to pay taxes or to suffer restrictions for the sake of an empire that they no longer needed. It was not in their interest to pay taxes, and you couldn't suppose that they would be such very peculiar people as to sacrifice self-interest to sentiment. They were breaking the law because they didn't like the law and because they felt strong enough to break it, and they meant to go on breaking it, but what they wanted was a good excuse for doing so, a rationalization, a justification of their stand. And so they started to talk a bit less about their rights as free-born Englishmen, and they started to talk a bit more about their natural rights as members of the human race. Natural law was much safer ground. It was ambiguous, it was fashionable, and it was just what American patriots needed. Natural law was moral, since it was based on a faith in God and in the perfection of his creation. It denied authority to any government which didn't rest on the consent of the governed. And it was, so to speak, in the air. It didn't have to be argued, it didn't have to be justified. People usually accepted it whole as a self-evident truth. Even so, the revolutionary argument did not rest wholly on natural rights alone. In fact, to start with, the revolutionary leaders had some trouble in deciding which rights they were defending, whether they were British rights or human rights. So they tried a bit of everything. The revolutionary leaders couldn't decide either whether the oppressor was King George or the Parliament. There were appeals for relief from the oppression of the king, which they addressed to Parliament. There were appeals for relief from the oppression of Parliament, which they addressed to the king. There were appeals based on colonial charters, which they addressed to the courts. There were also appeals to the classic virtues dear to the 18th century, and one Rhode Island patriot urged fellow Rhode Islanders to awaken, as he put it, all that is Roman in Providence. Arguments, however, don't make revolutions or win wars. The Revolutionary War was possible because the colonists were too far away for the British to repress the rebellion with the means available at the time. And the war was won because the enemies of England had an interest in helping the colonists who rebelled against her. The French especially were delighted to pay the English back for the loss of Canada. They supplied the insurgents with tens of thousands of muskets. Most of the gunpowder they used came from France. And finally, after the Americans had demonstrated that they weren't going to give in, the French came into the war, and they provided the military and naval support that actually won it. And if you want to know what Europeans thought the war was about, you have only to look where the peace was signed. Not in Boston, not in London, but in Versailles in 1783. That was the last victory of the French monarchy. And this painting was never finished, by the way, because the British refused to pose. So what Americans called the War of Independence was only won after a long struggle in which French aid and British incompetence were crucial, and in which the result was largely a matter of European power politics. Largely, but not entirely, for if in the end the colonists won, it was also because at the end of the 18th century, the economic principles on which the old colonial system rested were being discarded by Adam Smith and his followers in Britain, by a new generation of economists and philosophers in France. Out of the Enlightenment, a new philosophy of economic liberalism was rising over the West, a philosophy opposed to mercantilism and state regulation, a philosophy that taught that the wealth of nations was to be found in free trade, freedom of individual enterprise and competition, and the abolition of old restrictive laws of trade and navigation. And this movement of economic liberalism was part of the general 18th century movement of humanitarian and rationalistic reform in Europe, which meant that the economic reformers had made common cause with moralistic reformers who refused to sanction the coercion or oppression of subject peoples, including the colonists in America. So here you have a coalition between English businessmen who felt confident enough not to want a closed colonial market, and an English public confident enough to sympathize with moral and philosophical appeals, which meant that the English were deeply divided on the colonial issue, and the ones who stood for a hard policy towards the American rebels belonged mostly to the stupid party, as we can see from their conduct of the war, when over and over again it wasn't really the Americans who won, it was the English who lost. Next time, the influence of the American Revolution on Europe. Until then.
Funding for this program is provided by Annenberg CPB to advance excellent teaching. For information about this and other Annenberg CPB programs, call 1-800-LEARNER and visit us at www.learner.org.